Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to talk about the books that I read in October and November. So November was a bit of a slumpy reading month for me, so I never filmed my Victober wrap-up and I never posted any videos talking about my nonfiction November plans or the books that I read. So I'm going to be discussing all the books that I've read over the last 2 months, both the books that were part of readathons and then those that were just ordinary reads that I picked up outside of Victober or nonfiction November. And I'm also going to be talking about how all of these books slotted into prompts for the Fall Into Reading Challenge bingo board, which I did finish. I'll insert a picture of my finished bingo board. So some of these books I picked out specially to tie into Fall Into Reading Challenge prompts, and that is why I read them during October and November. There was one book that I read in September that I don't think I discussed in my September reading wrap-up, and I definitely didn't put on my Fall Into Reading Challenge bingo board because I thought I had another book in mind for that prompt, and then I never got around to reading that book. So now I'm going retrospectively back to September and saying that I read The Bridgertons Happily Ever After by Julia Quinn. This is the, I guess, compilation of all the second epilogues for the Bridgerton books. And I read this in fulfillment of the romance prompt. I had read most of the second epilogues previously, which is why I hadn't listed it in September. But when I was getting closer to the end of November and the end of the Fall Into Reading Challenge, I realized I wasn't going to have time to read another romance book. So even though I only read, I think, the last 2 novellas in this collection in September, I'm using that to cross off the romance prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. Then in October, I read 7 books. The first book that I finished was The Sign of the Four by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the second book in the Sherlock Holmes series, and it's one of his novel-length Sherlock Holmes stories. This was a reread for me because I have read the entire Sherlock Holmes story, but I really loved the first couple chapters in this book where we are following Sherlock and Dr. Watson kind of doing life in Baker Street, and it's just such a cozy Victorian parlor scene, and so I really enjoy that part. There definitely are some problematic elements to this story. The kind of main plot is focusing around events that took place in colonial India and some other British colonies, so there are definitely some viewpoints discussed that are no longer socially acceptable, but I think that's to be expected in some of these older Victorian books, and I still really enjoyed revisiting the Sherlock Holmes books, and I think I gave this a 4-star on my reread. And this one crossed off the takes place in fall prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. Then the next book that I read as part of my Victober reading was Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This is the second book in his Barchester series. And after having read The Warden probably 4 years ago now, I had kind of been putting off reading Barchester Towers. I had gotten stuck in the first chapters, like maybe twice, attempting to read this book before, but this time I listened to it on audiobook and I buddy read it with Lisa, a friend from Booktube here, and that made all the difference. And once I was past those kind of initial scene-setting chapters, I really enjoyed the story here. It really is a direct sequel to the events of The Warden, so I don't want to talk about the plot too much because there are spoilers for what happens in The Warden. But I felt like it had just the right amount of suspense and trying to figure out how the author was going to pull all the threads of the story together. And at the end, he did bring it into a very satisfying ending that just made the whole reading experience feel worthwhile. I ended up giving this 4 stars, and I'll definitely be continuing on with the Barchester series now. And this fulfilled the classics prompt on the Fall Into Reading Challenge bingo board. Then the group read for this year was Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I did not get through this entire book. You'll see I got just under halfway through the stories, but because these are all short stories or novellas collected, I did end up pulling 2 of the ones that I did finish and using those as novellas to finish prompts on the Fall Into Reading Challenge bingo board. So I read Disappearances, The Old Nurse's Story, The Squire's Story, and The Poor Clare from this collection, and I used The Old Nurse's Story as the supernatural prompt for Fall Into Reading Challenge, and I used The Poor Clare as the beloved author prompt. And both of these were longer stories, like multi-chapter short stories, really more novella length, so I don't feel that guilty about counting those towards the challenge, even though I didn't finish this book. But I am looking forward to picking this back up next Victober and having a few more of Elizabeth Gaskell's Gothic tales to keep me company next Victober. Of the ones that I read, I definitely enjoyed The Old Nurse's Story and The Poor Clare the most, which is part of the reason why I chose those for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. Disappearances was almost nonfiction, or at least it read like it was nonfiction. I'm not sure if it actually was nonfiction or just fiction written as if it was nonfiction, kind of telling little blurbs about the experiences that different people had with having family members disappear. And I think it really hit home how easy it was to disappear in the Victorian era before there was so much technology and ability to trace people's movements and identities. Then The Old Nurse's Story was, I thought, very excellent. That would be a 5-star story for me out of this collection. It was very gothic, had just the right amount of kind of spooky touch. We're hearing the story told through the eyes of an old nursemaid talking about the events that happened in this old manor house, which of course, being a gothic story, is haunted by the events of the past. Then the Squire's Story was a bit of a middling read for me. It was a bit more of like a horror or mystery story than a gothic story. Yeah, it was okay. It wouldn't be one that I would go back to reread. And then The Poor Clare was quite long, so that kind of got me bogged down in this collection because took me a while to finish reading it. But it definitely had some gothic elements where there is a curse placed on someone, and then the, I guess, ramifications of that curse stretch forward in the generations in unexpected ways. Then the last book that I finished reading for Victober is Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This was my second Thomas Hardy after reading The Mayor of Casterbridge over the summer, and I did really, really enjoy this book, but it definitely took me longer to read than expected. It was kind of small for a Victorian classic, so I thought I was going to be able to just fly through it, but there definitely is, as I should have suspected, some pretty heavy subject matter in this book, being a Hardy novel. So it did take me a little longer than I thought it would to read this book. I had managed to avoid spoilers my whole life about this story, even though it's a fairly well-known Victorian classic. So I won't go into too many of the details except to say that it was a little bit different than I thought it was going to be. I had heard so much talk about how this book was about Bathsheba Everdeen, who is a woman who inherits a farm, and kind of her challenges being accepted into the community and making a living as a farmer in a male-dominated society and a male-dominated trade. And while that is kind of the basic plot arc of this book, it's not written entirely from Bathsheba's perspective, which is what I had, I guess, imagined all my life about this book. So we do have chapters from a variety of perspectives, including her multiple love interests. So it was interesting. I did feel like I got to know all the people, I guess, involved in this story very well, and you could sympathize with all the characters, which made, I guess, different events throughout the book even more heartbreaking and hard-hitting. So many people have said this is one of Hardy's lighter books, or even his happiest book, and that The Mayor of Casterbridge also is not his most depressing novels. So after reading those two, I think Hardy may not be the Victorian author for me, because I did find this to be a bit of a downer. I think when I finished reading The Mayor of Casterbridge in our book club discussion about that, I think my main feedback was, well, you didn't feel great after finishing it, did you? And it's kind of the same for this. Even though it's a happy ending that comes at a price, and so it's not, I guess it's more of a bittersweet ending. So I don't know if I'll be reading more Hardy in the future, definitely spacing them out and not reading too many back-to-back. And I used this as the has something orange on the cover prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge, because my edition has this orange sunset kind of in the background of this snowy sheep herding scene. So that's what I read in October for Victober, and then I also had picked up a couple non-Victober reads over the month as well, because I had holds coming in from the library and I just wanted to break up my reading with a few different things. So I also read Mennonite Valley Girl, A Wayward Coming of Age by Carla Funk. This is a brand new publication by an author from British Columbia. It was just published this fall, and I was the first on the hold list at my library. This is pretty much exactly what it says in the title. It is a coming-of-age memoir of this girl's childhood. She grew up in a small town in BC that I know quite well because I had family members living there and I used to go visit every summer. So that was kind of the curiosity factor for me, was to read a book set in this small town and small community that I do recognize. You know, when I go to the shopping center, I'm like, oh yeah, I can imagine that shopping center. Unfortunately, I didn't really love this book. I ended up giving it 2 stars. I could tell that the author had a really beautiful writing style. It sounds like she mostly has written poetry before this, so I would love to pick up some of her poetry collections. But I found the stories in this book to not be as engaging as I had hoped, and they're kind of exactly the standard memoir fare that you read in every coming-of-age memoir. So I loved her writing style, but the content of the book wasn't that interesting to me. And I read Mennonite Valley Girl for the new to me author prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. And then it actually ended up being a bit of a 3-star run at the end of October for me, because I read 3 2-star reads in a row, which I think contributed to my reading slump in November. So the next 2-star book that I read was Matrix by Lauren Groff. Again, this is one where I really enjoyed the author's writing style. I thought there was some beautiful passages of writing, and I know she's written a few other well-known books that I'd be interested to pick up, but I had some issues with the subject matter and how she presented the main character that I guess impeded my enjoyment of this book. This book is set in England during the 1100s, and we are following a young woman who is part of the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she is the illegitimate daughter of one of the relatives to the king and queen, and because of her connections to the royal family, they don't want her to get married and have children that could have a claim to the throne, so she ends up getting sent to a convent, and we follow her over the entire course of her life then as a nun. My issue with the characterization was twofold. First, she tried to conflate kind of 2 real historical characters into a 3rd fictional character. So she used elements of this known illegitimate daughter, as well as Marie of France, who is a well-known medieval era author, and she conflated those 2 into this 3rd character that this book is about, but without really having any actual historical basis for a lot of the choices she made for this character and the way this character behaved. And if you know me, I love historical fiction because I love learning about things, so when I'm halfway through this book and then end up Googling this character because I'm thinking, oh, this is so interesting, I didn't know this, and then you find out, well, you didn't know it because it's actually kind of not true, or it's very presumptuous based off of the few facts that we have about Marie de France. So I would always rather read books that either have a fictional character living in a historical time period, where I know that kind of the trappings of society and the activities of daily life are based on historical fact, but that character is fictional and then I can enjoy them as a fictional character. Or I would rather read historical fiction that's based off of a real character that is actually following the facts of that individual's life. I also found the main character deeply unlikable, and I think that I was supposed to think of her as kind of this like very likable feminist hero, and so that was kind of a disconnect for me between, I think, the author's intentions and my perceptions. In my opinion, she twisted this character into someone that was deeply narcissistic, abusive to the fellow women in her community, heretical, and ultimately turned into a borderline cult leader, and I wasn't that sympathetic towards a lot of the actions that she took. So for that reason, I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I was going to, but I definitely would pick up more by Lauren Groff. A lot of the ways that she wrote things was very beautiful, and I think I could enjoy her writing in a different story. And I used the Matrix to cross off the published in 2021 prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. Then my last read of October and my last 2-star read of the month was If I Am Missing or Dead, A Sister's Story of Love, Murder, and Liberation by Janine Latus. This is a book that I kind of picked up on a whim from the free bookshelf at my office, and it wasn't really what I was expecting, which is why it got a lower rating. This is a nonfiction memoir by this woman whose sister was murdered in a domestic violence incident, and so it definitely was heavy reading. The entire family had had a history of dealing with domestic abuse in their childhood and in relationships, so it was difficult to read. I thought this was going to be more of a true crime story, I guess, centering around the details of the sister's murder and kind of bringing her killer to justice, but ultimately it really was much more about how I guess both the woman and her sister had had so many abusive events in their life and how they had ended up being in these relationships where they were subject to domestic violence. The title of the book, If I Am Missing or Dead, comes from a letter that they found in the sister's possessions after she went missing, where she had written a letter basically saying, if I am missing or dead, it was probably my boyfriend, and kind of these are why you should suspect him. So I thought it was going to be a lot more kind of dealing with that aspect, but honestly, the actual events of the murder and the police investigation didn't happen until maybe 80% of the way through the book. So that's kind of the reason that it got the lower star rating from me. And it definitely was also quite a heavy-hitting, emotional book to read. And I read this for the thriller prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. Then in November, I also read 7 books, and the first book that I'm going to talk about is the book that I read for Nonfiction November, and that is The Only Plane in the Sky by Garrett Groff. This book is called An Oral History of 9/11 because the author has brought together, I think, more than 500 eyewitness accounts and pieces of evidence from the 9/11 terrorist attacks and brought them together into one book. So we have multiple people's stories, we have excerpts from like flight logs, we have like police dispatches and 911 calls, and then lots and lots of people telling their stories. It was a multicast audiobook, so I think they had more than 50 narrators, so you really felt like you were listening to these people tell their stories, as well as interspersed with actual archival footage. This was an absolutely incredible read. Even though it's quite a long audiobook, I listened to it over the course of 2 days, and I just could not stop listening to the story unfold. Even though all of us know eventually how it's going to end, I still found myself getting very emotionally invested in these people's stories. I cried multiple times. It's an absolutely incredible audiobook. I would highly recommend it. The book is told chronologically, so we start right in the early morning, and we kind of hear from the people who checked in the hijackers onto the plane, people describing kind of their ordinary morning, and then we unfold into the events of the day, and then obviously we end up into, by the end of the day, hearing from people who were involved in the rescue missions at the crash sites. I definitely know it's going to end up on my nonfiction favorites, and I read this to complete the published before 2021 prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. Then the next book that I read in November was Light from Heaven by Karon. This is the 9th book in the Mitford series, and if you want to hear more of my thoughts about this book, you can check out our live stream for this book with the rest of my Year in Mitford crew, Kate Howe, Angie from Literary Labours, and Rainey from Rainy Day Reads. We had our live stream over on Kate Howe's channel towards the end of November. This book I read for the leaves on the cover prompt because even though I listened to this on audiobook, the cover that I found on Goodreads had these kind of gold leaves all down the edge. After taking a 2-month pause from reading the Mitford books, it was so nice to be back in Mitford with Father Tim and Cynthia and following along with Dooley. There are some really, really sweet scenes in this book, and it's definitely one of my favorites in the series so far. I ended up giving it 4 stars. The next book I read is another one that I guess could count towards my nonfiction November reading because it is a memoir, Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversion by Abigail Favale. I absolutely loved this memoir. I gave it 5 stars. I found that her writing was both approachable and informative, and I enjoyed reading a conversion story written from the perspective of a woman. I don't know what her age is, but kind of some of the perspective of things that she was talking about really felt like it was someone of a younger generation, kind of similar in age to myself than some of the other conversion stories out there. The next book that I read fulfilled the contemporary prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge, and that is Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. This is the debut novel of a young Canadian author, and we are following Gilda, who is kind of going through a rough time in life. She is having a lot of mental health issues and really preoccupied, I guess, with death, really. And so she sees a flyer for free therapy being held at this local church. And when she arrives for the therapy session, there's some misunderstandings that ensue, and the priest thinks that she's there to interview for the parish secretary job because the woman who used to work there had just passed away. So she ends up kind of accidentally working in the parish office at this Catholic church and kind of building a bigger and bigger web of lies about who she is, what she believes, and who is and isn't still alive as she tries to build a believable persona as a parish secretary. There were some elements that I really enjoyed about this book, and a few times where I did have to just laugh out loud. Ultimately, I felt like it was a bit too much in the main character's head for the kind of books that I like to read, so there was a lot of kind of internal monologuing and going back and forth through this person's thoughts. So I did give this book 2 stars. Then I finally finished The Death of Comrade President by Alain Mabanckou. This is a book that I had started earlier in the summer and then put aside, and I'm not even sure why, because I did really enjoy it. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and this book fulfills the Author of Color prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. This is a really unique story. We're following a young boy living in Congo-Brazzaville when their president is assassinated. And so we're seeing these big political events through his eyes, while at the same time he's mostly concerned because his little puppy has run away. When the radio announcement came off, the dog got spooked and ran away. So while the adults in his family are very preoccupied with what's going to happen politically in their country, the boy is torn between, I guess, kind of this larger existential worry and then the more practical worry of how he's going to locate his dog. I think it was really unique to have this child narrator, and I really enjoyed the way that the author sprinkled in a lot of random little nods to African political events in the 70s. There was some things that I recognized from different African studies classes that I've taken at university, and overall I just really enjoyed this book. And we'll definitely be picking up more of his work in the future. And then lastly, the last prompt for the Fall Into Reading Challenge that I had to complete was the fantasy prompt. And I basically never read fantasy, so I was stuck kind of in the last week of November Googling like favorite short story, fantasy, favorite fantasy novella, Reddit, trying to find some ideas of shorter fantasy books or novella length stories that I could read that I might enjoy. And I ended up settling upon The Hedge by George R.R. Martin. This is actually apparently a prequel to his Game of Thrones series. It's part of a trilogy of prequel novellas, so this is the first in this story. To be honest, there wasn't a ton of fantasy elements in it. There was a couple mentions of dragons, and that was kind of it, besides having obviously all of the houses from Game of Thrones also mentioned. I haven't read or watched Game of Thrones, so I feel like there was a lot of little references and nods to events that I probably missed out on. I could see sometimes where it was like, oh, I think that might be a reference, or if I knew what had happened in Game of Thrones, I would probably be like really interested in these interactions between these families, but I don't have that backstory, so I was kind of going into it blind, not really knowing what existing rivalries I should be looking out for. But basically we're following a young man who has been a squire for a hedge knight for many years, and when his master dies, he kind of takes on the persona of a knight and goes to fight in this tournament to try to make his fortune, I guess, and be respected as a knight in the community. So I'm still not converted over to fantasy, but I did enjoy elements of it, and I might continue on with the other 2 novellas in the trilogy just to see where Sir Duncan ends up. So those are the books that I read in October and November as part of Victober, Nonfiction November, and the Fall Into Reading Challenge. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the books I've read over the past 2 months, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.